cybersecurity, occupying various roles for the past 10 years. And I'm currently with Sophos, ex-SecureWorks, and I am beyond excited to be with you here today. Last day of DefCamp, so we're almost done, we're almost at the end. But for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I will reiterate that this year is a big one for DefCamp because we are celebrating 15 years. So this is our 15th edition, proudly powered by Orange Business. So think about it, 15 editions of teamwork, passion, dedication, and relentless focus. So what to expect for this year's edition? Well, let's talk some numbers. First number will be 4. So we do have 4 dynamic stages with nearly 90 exceptional speakers, from deep dive technical presentations to high impact business panels. Another number is 14, so 14 thrilling hacking competitions with tons of prizes waiting to be won. And then, of course, we have multiple challenges and flags hidden throughout the expo area and hacking village. So feel free to jump in, compete, and who knows, at the end of the day, you may walk away with cash prizes and exclusive goodies. But as always, networking is key. So with participants joining us from around the world, it's the perfect opportunity to exchange knowledge, share ideas, and build meaningful connections. And obviously, don't forget to visit our partners' booths. And yeah, speaking of our amazing partners, I'd like to take a moment to extend our deepest gratitude to our partners, starting with Orange Business, whose long-standing support has been essential to DefCamp evolution. DefCamp is proudly organized by CCSIR, the Cybersecurity Research Center from Romania. A big thank you to MasterCard for joining this year's edition and helping us elevate the DefCamp experience year after year. And we're equally grateful to Adobe, Sophos, and BitSentinel for standing by us and contributing to this remarkable edition. Thank you Booking Holdings, Bitdefender, Pentest Tools, Siemens, CyberEDU, Superbet, and Datacore Systems for all your support and involvement. And of course, our heartfelt appreciation goes out to our broader community, all the partners that helped to bring the 15th edition of DefCamp to life. So thank you for showing up with passion and enthusiasm. DefCamp thrives because of you, its unique community. And now, with all that out of the way, we do have a packed day today, so let's get started. And we are kicking things off with Klara Kim, who is a cybersecurity researcher and a BOB, Best of the Best, program alumni with bachelor's degree in InfoSec, who specializes in threat modeling and consulting across emerging technologies, including robotics and CubeSats, and she's here to talk to us about securing space, threat assessment and remediation analysis for Nanosatellite on board computers. Klara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Klara Kim, and I'm quite nervous to be on stage today, but yes, I'm on stage with my colleague, so I am very happy to introduce my colleague who's going to take about a portion of our stage today, Donavan. Will you take on the stage first? Thank you.
All right, good morning to everyone. Welcome to our presentation on securing space. So I think unlike the other presentations, this one will be focused on some systems that do not even reside on Earth, but rather in orbit around Earth. So what we're going to be covering today, we will first bring you through an overview of cybersecurity in space. So we are going to be talking a bit about nanosatellites, how many there are, what kind of missions they do, etc., right? And then we will look into threat modeling of these nanosatellites, because obviously, like any other digital system, issues can happen. So we're going to be using MITRE Embed and Tara as our frameworks of choice for today's talk. And lastly, we will also talk about combining of these threat modeling frameworks to deploy these nanosatellites securely by design. If all is good, I shall begin. So, introduction to us. We are Team SatCrack, basically satellite cracking group. And what we do research into space systems, right? Cybersecurity in space systems. As what Klara mentioned, we have a team. And here you have 2 of the members, right? Klara and myself. We also have 2 other members of the team. One fun fact about a team of 4 is that all 4 of us have at some point in time also took part in something called the Global Cybersecurity Camp. So if you are familiar with DefCamp, you might notice there is a section on the website about GCC. So I encourage the students in the audience to consider signing up for it because I think it will be a life-changing experience for you. Okay. Now that I've got the introduction out of the way, let's talk about nanosatellites. So what are they? As per what the slide suggests, they are very small satellites. And these are very, very small satellites that are typically developed by many different groups. They can be universities, they can be governments, they can be companies, right? And these are in contrast to the really large satellites that you may be familiar with in movies, simply because, first of all, not everybody has all that much money or budget to develop a big satellite. So what do? Some people come together to build a nanosatellite. And you can see from the price that is indeed much cheaper, right? $50,000 to $150,000 and you can build one, as compared to satellite missions that will cost you good millions of dollars, right? One fun fact is that if you look at the number of nanosats that have been launched as of this year, we are looking at a total of nearly 3,000 of them. So if you do a bit of mathematics, we are talking about 9 satellites being launched every day. That's actually quite substantial. Okay, so where are these satellites being launched in the world? So if you look, right, mostly they are in the United States, right, about half of them. But you can see there are satellites owned by different entities from around the world that also launch satellites. I think though we want to take this term around the world somewhat carefully, because in reality, if you talk about collaboration with universities and companies, these can be multinational, right? But you know, at some point you have to declare where your satellite actually comes from. Okay, a bit more statistics. So as I was mentioning, we are talking about an increasing number of nanosats being launched. This graph is as of 30th of April 2025, which is about 6 months ago. So that's why you notice that down here you see that the numbers aren't quite there yet. If you want to find the latest graphs, you can visit this website called nanosats.eu, and you can see lots of different infographics about the statistics of nanosatellites. I think that will be of some interest to you. But maybe I will just talk about one more graph before we go into the real meat, okay? So we look at total number of nanosatellites and CubeSats launched, okay? So as you can see, the numbers are indeed increasing, but what's probably more important to look at is this second line, the number of CubeSats launched, of course, including the launch failures. So as you can see, I talked about 2,900-ish nanosatellites, of which about 90% of them are CubeSats. So in the presentation, you may hear me talk a bit about CubeSats. Okay, I may be using this somewhat interchangeably because what we are researching on is focused mostly on CubeSats. So if all that is good, then let's begin. Now, unfortunately, as is life, there are problems, right? And one big problem is that in the satellite space, remember, I mentioned that you can build a satellite as cheaply as $50,000 to $150,000. So what does that mean? That means if you have to look into ways to optimize your budget, meaning to say you need to make sure your satellite launches, your satellite captures useful data, your satellite has protection against radiation in space, well, what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen is that you probably don't care very much about security, and that's part of the issue, but that's probably also why we all have jobs in the first place, okay? So we typically have very tight budgets, we have very, very tight deadlines, simply because research waits for no one. If any of you is in the research space, you know that if a research team publishes a paper before you, that's kind of it, right? And then, because these satellites are so small, the form factors are really quite small, what happens is that they also have very limited capabilities, meaning to say some of these, for example, they have very limited hardware, so it may be the case that even if I wanted to install a security solution on the satellite itself, I can't because I do not have enough processing power. And the last point is perhaps very interesting because now that this space has been democratized in the sense that it's much cheaper to build satellites, there have, of course, been many more manufacturers selling different kinds of parts. And quite a lot of these actually come from places like China, etc. And you can just buy these off the shelf. Now, if you buy them off the shelf, then the question goes, how secure are these things? Well, that depends on the supply chain in which these guys have in making these more available. Sometimes more available in this case also means it's going to be maybe less secure by design because most people simply want the satellite to be launched. As I mentioned, these are affordable, so you have even groups like hobbyists who just want to launch a satellite for the fun of it. Okay. Now, because of that, we are looking at some issues where we have some rising cybersecurity risks. And I guess the screenshot here is quite nice to show you because this is one such open source project, I think it's ORSET, right? Whereby they open source the code, but as you can tell, the developers were not very diligent. So we found that the developers were happily leaving comments behind, right? That said, they didn't really know how to deal with some issues, like for example, how to assign memory, or how to, in this case, what the text says here. I'll just read it to you guys because it's a bit small, right? It says this, AN3154 says NEC if readout protection is enabled. I think this is something in the option bytes, but we don't use it. I'm too lazy to check right now. Okay, by the way, this is not the only mention in that code repository. So that should tell you how constrained this is, right? Now, in satellite security, there's also perhaps another problem. And the problem is that orbits are shared by everybody around the world. And this means you have civilians that launch satellites because they want to do research. You also have missions whereby they are not so nice, right? For example, reconnaissance missions, military missions, etc. And because of that, some satellites are dual use, okay? And because of these, you see that there are, number one, rising number of conflicts in the concept of operations. And also, because of that, if you look at the satellite space itself, you are basically mixing hobbyist satellites with military-grade satellites, etc. What could possibly go wrong, right? Of course, many things. And because of the tight schedule with which these satellites are being launched, really, if you talk about the security testing process, not much. Okay. So I don't really need to belabor the point further, right? The point is that there is simply too little time, too little money in this space. Okay, so let's perhaps do a bit more scaring of you guys to convince you that satellite security is a real issue, okay? So in a 25-year history of threats, so we just basically picked a few of the many attacks in the satellite space, right? But I thought the 1999 one was quite interesting because basically there was some kid that managed to breach into some NASA systems and cause some shutdown of the systems. NASA, of course, disputes that the attacker in this case breached critical systems, but I guess this was quite an embarrassment to NASA itself. So they said, yeah, we're going to harden these systems. And guess what? If you try to search NASA cyber attack, you would realize that they got breached again. Okay? So that's one example. Another example which was perhaps interesting was the 2024 case. And this 2024 case, the Intelsat case was interesting because basically a satellite was lost in mission and it remains quite a speculative exercise on whether or not this was due to a cyber incident. But the broader learning point is that if you think about some of the aspects of satellites I mentioned just now, that they're not very secure by design, right? And then you have satellites just randomly blowing up, one has to wonder what might have happened, right? So these are some of the doubts in this space that make satellite cybersecurity quite interesting to study. Okay. Now, here is some nice pictures, right? On the left, you see nice architecture diagrams. On the right is actually chipsets. This is based out of the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, right? And in this case, you see complex architecture, you see chipsets. What is not on the diagram, which is perhaps something I should mention, is that even the choice of operating system on these satellites is not very consistent. When we were basically searching up and checking out with other satellite research groups, we realized that there is no real convergence in the operating system that is being used. So if you searched up satellite operating system on the internet today, you will notice a common operating system called FreeRTOS, right? RT, it means real time because basically you need to be able to run commands very, very quickly. But if you spoke to the groups in NTU, you would realize that these guys are actually using embedded Windows, okay? So there is no real convergence in this space, and it honestly remains to be seen what operating system eventually comes as a de facto standard. Because when we spoke to the Japanese said they even launched a modified version of our Arduino into space. So really no standard to this. Now, but we need to talk about some very basic building blocks, otherwise there is nothing in the threat model. So let's go through some simple components, right? There's of course some core technology that's needed. You need core, think of it as the brain of the satellite. So you have something called the onboard computer. And the onboard computer basically performs central control and subsystem management. In satellites, there are many different subsystems and you need one system to rule them all. So that's the onboard computer. okay? As you can tell, this is very, very modularized. So in case one subsystem fails, you don't have a whole satellite failing all at once, right? That's why you have, you need to have a master to control a bunch of different subsystems. Now, you also have the communications subsystem, basically uplink, downlink, because your satellite needs to communicate with ground station to be able to transfer meaningful data. For example, you have a satellite that goes in orbit, and periodically you need some updates on how, on the kind of data that is being collected, so you need that. Otherwise, the issue is that you launch a satellite and you don't get the results until years later. But maybe years later, you did not realize that the satellite has actually crashed. So that's not good, so you need communications. Then of course you need payloads. Different satellites have different functions. Some are there just to collect data, some are there to maybe investigate some other scientific phenomenon, etc. So these are very mission specific, so you have the payload as well. And then something very, very important. As we mentioned, these satellites, they are up in space, but we need to be able to correctly define which orbit they are in, because depending on the orbit that you're in space, they rotate around the Earth at different rates. In other words, you will expect to be able to collect different kinds of data, etc., but you need to be able to calculate these. And to be able to make sure that you launch into the right orbit and to monitor to make sure that things are good, you need to have an ADCS, or what we call an altitude determination and control system, okay? And then we have a few other systems. I will not go through everything, but I will just quickly run through that. Of course, you need power, so you need electrical power system to monitor power to be able to control this. And, well, we do not expect that the satellite can last entirely on battery power, so we also need to harvest power in space. And that's why you have solar panels. And of course, when we talk about communications, we also have an antenna on this. So all in all, if you look at different kinds of nanosatellites, they will come with these core components, okay? So this is what I wanted to mention. Next, let's dive a bit deeper into the onboard computer, the OBC, right? And these are typically very, very low-powered microcontrollers, okay? And you can see one example over here. They're very small, but in these small devices, you basically empower them with very, very critical functions. Basically, if the OBC is compromised, the satellite just stops functioning, okay? So basically, that's how important it is. Except that the problem is that because the form factor is so small, and this is particularly in the CubeSat space, we realize that many of these OBCs do not have proper memory management units, etc. There's lots of improvisation to make sure that commands can be sent very efficiently. So if you try to search whether or not there are MMUs in CubeSat OBCs, you will realize that the answer is not so clear-cut. Well, if it's not so clear-cut, it means two things. Number one, it is not a standard. And number two, if the research team can get away without additional costs, they might actually do it. And this has some implications. The first implication here that we're going to talk about, well, simply put, if you don't have memory management, you don't have any process isolation or any sort of user kernel separation. Quite bad. Okay. And I think I've already mentioned this before, but I thought I'll repeat this once again. Satellites, they are most concerned about functionality. Then you talk about communications, power, and you do all of these before you think about security, right? And in the satellite space, it used to be the case that people were not very interested to attack satellite systems because these, many years ago, were more confined in the domains of the military and research fields. But as I mentioned, hobbyists are now into this as well, and so the attack surface has changed. Unfortunately, the culture of satellite teams has not changed so much. And because of that, the topic of threat modeling becomes very, very relevant. Now, let's talk about threat modeling per se. And for those of you who are new to threat modeling and you needed to summarize this in a few sentences so you can explain to your CISO why you should do this, well, threat modeling is simply put, a systematic approach to identify, analyze, and prioritize system threats. And a good way to summarize this is something called the Threat Modeling Manifesto. So you can search up Threat Modeling Manifesto and it gives you a one-pager of what threat modeling is about. I will quickly mention this. So we need to understand scope. What are we working on? Is it a satellite or is it some application within it, etc., right? Then next, what can go wrong? And this is usually the fun part, right? And this is the part that my team members have the most amount of fun with. We want to understand what can go wrong in these satellites because truth is, many things can go wrong. And in the satellite space, it is very interesting simply because you also look at it from the hardware perspective as well as the software perspective. And then unfortunately, as per life, we are not paid simply by breaking systems. We want to be able to tell people how to fix them. So what are we going to do about it? So we need to look into mitigations. And in the satellite space, it's particularly challenging because of the reasons I mentioned, computational limits. We also don't have enough money, so we're going to do about that. And then the last question, which is ultimately the most important question, that determines whether you get your paycheck, right? Whether or not we do a good enough job. Okay. I have already mentioned some of these constraints, right? We have limited resources. The attack surface can be very complicated because we talk about the various communication channels. You need to understand different kinds of protocols. So if you talk about, say, how the modules are being connected at the subsystem level, we use things like UART. So for folks who deal with IoT security, you will see such terms come in familiar. But if you also look at some of the applications that get installed on them, you realize that you also need to look into software security aspects. Now, these satellites are also being launched in orbit, and you can't always communicate with these satellites. So you cannot apply certain standards that you would have done in the world of IT, like for example, vulnerability and patch management. So if you find something vulnerable one fine day on these systems, you check your BOM, and you realize, hey, we deploy this in space. Except that maybe your satellite, as of that point, is on the other side of the Earth, you have no way of communicating with it. So you have patch limitations. You need to think about that. And of course, threat modeling also is quite nice in some sense, especially for where I work, right? It brings in the application team, the system teams, and all these disparate teams to come together and actually agree on the proper system representation of what they're working on, okay? Now, this slide is going to be the heaviest slide so far, but when we talk about threat modeling, people always talk about many different frameworks, because it's always a question that we ask, oh, what framework do you use? I will not go through this table in detail, but the most important point to mention is that there are different threat modeling frameworks. They are useful for different contexts. If you are a beginner to threat modeling, you would probably have heard of one by Microsoft, which is called Stride. Okay? But there are many others there which solve different pain points for cybersecurity teams. In this case, for SatCrack, what we ended up looking at is MITRE Embed, because a satellite can be seen as an embedded device, and we also use Klara to be able to systematically show you the risk factors and to be able to communicate this story to all of you today so that you're able to appreciate whether or not certain threats that we uncover are actually threats that we should work on. Okay? So that's that. Of course, if you want to find out a bit more about threat modeling, this is a plug for my afternoon talk at track 1 in the afternoon, where I'll be talking about threat modeling in greater detail. Okay. So at this point, I would like to hand over to Klara. She will bring you through the frameworks, what we did, MITRE Embed, Klara, etc. Right? So Klara.
Thank you, Donavan. Okay, so I would like to now talk about why we chose MITRE Embed and what it is. So practically, MITRE Embed is a threat model specifically designed for embedded systems. Things like IoT devices, robots, and of course, satellites. So it was officially released last year, September, so it's kind of new to this threat modeling community. And it's based on the STIX 2.1 format, which means all the data is structured and machine automated, machine readable so that it can be used for automated threat mapping and analysis. So the core idea is pretty simple. It connects properties, threats, and mitigations, or what we call PID, TID, and MID. So in short, Embed answers 3 questions. What do we have? And what could go wrong? And what can we do about it? Yep. So how does Embed actually work? It follows really straightforward 3 steps. First, you identify the device properties. Second, you map the properties to the threats. And then you can identify the mitigations. So why did we choose Embed for nanosatellites? Well, nanosatellites, onboard computers, or OBCs, are basically embedded systems in orbit. They run real-time tasks, have very limited compute power, and packed with exposed interfaces. Embed helps us map those design features directly to real threats and real mitigations. This means we can start building security by design right from the mission's planning phase, instead of trying to patch things later. Okay, let's go on to Tara. Tara is traditionally used in automotive industry, but it is just as essential, if not more, in satellite systems, especially nanosats. A CubeSat may be very tiny, but the cost is never tiny. Once you consider the hardware, the engineering effort, the testing, and the launch, even a tiny nanosat represents a very real, very expensive investment. And unlike cars or IoT devices, a satellite gets only one chance. A single vulnerability can result in a total mission loss, a loss of irreplaceable scientific data, and complete loss of all launch and development costs. But the impact doesn't stop at all at the mission level. A malfunctioning or a compromised satellite can create debris, disrupt the space ecosystem, or even pose collision risks onto the other national assets. In other words, satellite security is not just a technical issue. It is closely tied to national security itself. So why we chose Tara is because it provides a structured method to prioritize and manage the threats. It converts qualitative threats into quantitative risk values. And also it complements embed by evaluating likelihood, impact, and mitigation effectiveness. Okay, yep. So let me briefly walk through the 4 steps of Tara and explain why we apply them to nanosats. Step 1, we identify assets and threats. In our case, this starts with embed mapping. We take each subsystem, the OBC, and map all applicable threat IDs from embed. Step 2, we assess exposure and feasibility. Here we ask how likely is exploitation. For satellites, feasibility is unique because there's no physical access after launch. Attacks often occur through RF links. Pre-launch insider threats still matter, and resource limitations change how realistic an attack can be. Now, step 3, we estimate the impact, and step 4, we determine risk and prioritize mitigations. Now we integrate MITRE's embed framework into Tara's process, and it's actually a perfect match. We start by defining the system scope, identifying CubeSat assets and their interfaces using embed's PIDs. Then we map those threats to embed's TID catalog. Next, we use Tara's model to score those threats based on the likelihood and impact. And finally, we prioritize the mitigations using embed's MID library. This creates a closed-loop workflow where we can go from design to threat identification to quantitative risk to mitigation all in one flow. But this doesn't mean that it's a one-time task to be done. Threat modeling and assessment needs to be continuously done. So the first step is to define the system scope. We can do it by identifying the assets and the interfaces. So how it goes is that you would identify and define the system scope by extracting system properties from the OBC datasheet. Look at the CPU, memory, interfaces, firmware, sensors, and classify each asset. You could validate it again with the datasheet evidence for accuracy. Here we did some sorting on our own with the COT OBC in university specs. We categorized the properties and wrote details in this chart. And then what we did is we selected the properties in the MITRE embed tool. It's done easily by the property mapper. When we put in the properties, it gives us possible matching threats that can happen there. So for example, if a device includes a microprocessor, there could be 4 main threats that we could keep in mind. If the device includes a hardware access port, such as the UART or JTAG port, we can get three threats provided by embed, which is very valid, and etc. So here's the properties for our CubeSat. You can see how we sorted it out. There's the microprocessor, the memory subsystem, memory bus, the storage, memory, debug access, bootloader, and so on. We categorized them into the 4 categories that embed required. And yeah. So yes, that's how we identified our properties. And now moving on, we're going to identify the threats, which was slightly shown on the previous slides. And we used the embed threat library on this. The properties are mapped to the threats, and there are lots and lots of threats mapped on the properties. And they actually provide the threat maturity as well, and I will speak about that later on. Note that this is not an exhaustive list of all the threats on a Nanosat OBC. There's actually much more on this. So now here is where it gets hard. Threat modeling is all about imagination and exploring what can go wrong. And it's very interesting and very fun to do. However, we need to know what is critical and what is not. I remember looking into ISO 31000, which is about risk management. So assessing the risk can help us decide which threats to mitigate now and which threats to mitigate later on or which to ignore. According to the Klara methodology, the metrics we can use to assess the exposure and we can use is to accessibility, the complexity, and required resources. So each attack vector gets a risk score based on a weighted combination of 5 factors: locality, confidentiality impact, availability impact, prior use, and stealth. We score each one as low, medium, and high, then multiply it by its weight. 0.2 for locality, confidentiality, and availability, and 0.3 for prior use, and 0.1 for stealth. This gives us a clear picture of both the impact and feasibility of each impact. In the table, threat ID 119 stands out to be the highest score of 3.0. It affects many units, has strong confidentiality and availability impact, and it's technique commonly seen in the wild. And this matters because nanosats can't afford to mitigate everything. By scoring threats this way, we can focus limited time and resource on what truly matters. So now we know which risk to prioritize, and now we dive deeper to prioritize which one to mitigate. Here you can see the threat susceptibility matrix, which aligns the highest risk attack vectors with the components they impact, such as the OS firmware, ports and debug, buses, CPU, and so on. Based on the previous slide, the 2 highest risk items are highlighted TID 119 and TID 115. Both involve hardware debug interfaces and unauthorized firmware access. This tells us something very important for nanosats. Latent debug ports and hardware interfaces are extremely dangerous. They allow direct code manipulation, firmware extraction, or memory tampering, and in a satellite, that means mission loss. So this slide shows how we map a high-risk threat to its embedded mitigations. For example, threat ID 119, the latent hardware debug port issue is dangerous because debug ports like JTAG or SWD provide full memory and code access. Now you might think, but after launch, no one can physically access the satellite anyway, so why does this matter? But the real problem isn't the post-launch access. The real risk is pre-launch access during manufacturing, integration, testing, or even student lab work. So if someone extracts firmware and modifies the bootloader or plants the backdoor at that stage, that backdoor becomes permanent once the satellite is in orbit. There is no hardware reset, no physical recovery, and no chance to fix it. So the foundational mitigations recommended by Embed is disabling all debug ports and enabling hardware readout protection, which ORSAT didn't do, are not optional. So they're the minimal protections needed to ensure that no one can tamper with the satellite before it ever leaves the ground. So this is a screenshot of how it looks in embed. And this is also an example of how we visualized it. So now we can see that the threat ID 101 has 3 suggested mitigations, which is foundational and intermediate level. We can also see the matching compliances that align with the IEC 62443. Another way to see which mitigation comes first, just by using the embed framework, is by looking at the threat and mitigation maturity score. I scored the maturity by how exploitable it is and how foundational the mitigation is. So you basically calculate the score by multiplying the threat maturity score and mitigation maturity score. And boom, you get the score, and the higher the score, the more significant it is to mitigate. So up to this point, we identified threats, scored their risk, and matched them to the correct embed mitigation IDs. Now we combine those mitigations with the countermeasure table, which includes the cost index and the effectiveness for each threat. What you see here is essentially a prioritized catalog of what we can actually do. This table shows the cost and effectiveness of each mitigation. P means preventive, M means mitigative, and the cost index tells us how hard or expensive it is to implement. So here I have a prototype of a demo which the Nanosat team can use. We can get a whole list of the threats here. So basically, if you use this tool, which is a CubeSat Advanced Threat and Compliance Kit, you enter the target file. And yeah, they analyze the properties and tell which threat and which mitigation should be prioritized. So this is the case for our nanosat that we analyzed. And to make it more visualized, this is how it's visualized. So you can see it by the threat levels and the PID categories to see what should be mitigated. So if you click on the threat IDs itself, it shows which mitigations and what it aligns on the IEC 62443. Because compliances are also so important. Yes, so we didn't hack an orbiting satellite yet. We built the threat model first, and our team is now developing a real hardware testbed to responsibly validate the attacks. And the reason this matters is very simple. Today's space missions rely on tiny satellites built on the tiny schedules, reused software, and unverified hardware. And a single overlooked vulnerability on Earth can become permanent, uncontrollable failure in orbit. So as we wrap up, I'd like to share 3 gentle but very important key points. First, nanosats are amazing, but they're also inherently limited. They operate with tight constraints on power, computing, and memory. And in many teams, security naturally becomes something to handle later. Our goal isn't to criticize that, it's simply to acknowledge the reality. So we can design better protections and that fit these constraints. Second, Embed and Klara really complement each other well. Embed helps us understand the technical threats in a structured way, and while Klara helps us focus on ones that matter the most for the mission. Together, they gave us a clearer and more practical path forward. And finally, security by design isn't about adding heavy security. It's about making sure satellites can carry out their mission safely once they're in orbit. Because after launch, we don't get second chances. If we build thoughtfully from the start, we can protect both the mission and the environment it files in. So the message is simple. With the right approach, nanosat security is absolutely achievable. And it can be done in a way that supports, not burdens, the mission. So I think that's all we have for today, and thank you so much for having us. I hope to see you again out in the field someday. Thank you.
So we do have time for a few questions. If you can raise your hands, and we'll pass the mic around.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting and fascinating subject, the nanosatellites. I was not sure if I understood correctly. So once in the orbit, a nanosatellite could communicate or be hacked from ground, or it's impossible to be reached by an attacker?
Okay, so if I get your question correctly, you are asking, right? Say if I launch a satellite in orbit, whether or not it's likelier that the satellite gets hacked while it's in orbit or pre-launch?
Yes.
Okay. Mostly pre-launch, simply because, first of all, it's more accessible, right? And if you look at the pre-launch risks, then it goes back to like what kind of protections you can put onto the satellites. Perhaps one point that I thought would be nice to bring up, maybe I'll just go back to one of the slides, right? It is not said directly, but if you look at, say, for example, a frame. So this is a frame of a CubeSat, right? Now, the reality is that when a satellite goes on the mission, it does not bring only one payload, right? It could be multiple different groups that come together with their payloads, and then we put them all together onto one satellite before it's sent to launch. So if you think about that, actually, if I may borrow a term, which is not very nice to borrow, but if you think about it, it's a multi-tenant system, right? So if you, say, for example, have a certain mission that is somewhat classified, you would, of course, be quite concerned about security risks from your other tenants. So pre-launch, very important, because one of the main risks that we are looking at is essentially this.
Hello. Thank you again for the presentation. It was really nice. I wanted to ask about the demo using the SatCheck tool. I saw that it was used with a file. What exactly does that file contain for it to use?
Yes, it contains the data sheet of the OBC, like the one we showed before. So you can see the data sheet that we provided, and we organized it into a JSON file and then put it in our tool, and it matched the threads with using the embed framework. Yep.
Thank you. Is that tool publicly available? SatCheck?
Not yet, but we will put it on GitHub.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, just to rebound to the previous question about the communication with the satellite and possibility to hack the satellite when it's on the orbit. For example, the patch channel. What's the probability that this channel is being hacked?
The probability that what is being hacked? The satellite in orbit?
The communication channel on which you send the patches.
The communication channel in which you send the patches. Okay. From what I have read, and I might not be the best person to answer this, and I'll tell you why. So if you look at the satellite space, the amount of research we can get as a research team of this sort is actually quite limited. So we have to base off public information, okay? So if we talk about public information, then it appears to us at least that the communication channel is not the main, I would say, main vector of attack when it comes to these satellite systems. So the chances are not that high. Having said that, now you talk about patching, and that also raises an interesting question, right? You have limited time of communication with your satellite. So what payloads do you prioritize when you send the uplink? And that becomes actually the bigger problem, whether or not we want to send maybe, for example, uplink of patches, or maybe there is some sort of detail that I need to send uplink, for example, upgrade to a module, which takes precedence. So that's, to me, I think the bigger risk as opposed to the patch itself being compromised while being sent uplink.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. And another round of applause to Donavan and Klara. Excellent. Perfect. Now we can really say that this presentation was out of this world.